Hello everyone, in this review video, the topic is going to be healthcare. And I wanted to talk about healthcare. We talked about healthcare for about 3 days, so that way you can understand that you can really apply a lot of the tools that you developed in government and economics and even other classes to understand and get a fuller picture of a very, very complex issue. So I think I'm going to start off with where we ended. We talked about healthcare for like 3 days. Which is the Affordable Care Act, which was one of the signature pieces of legislation signed by President Obama. And so we said that the Affordable Care Act had 3 prongs. It banned insurance price discrimination. It installed an individual mandate, and it provided subsidies so people could acquire health insurance. And we talked about the comparatively low, or we talked about how prior to Obamacare, there was a significant percentage of the American population that was uninsured, and sort of the issues related to this. And President Obama's signature piece of legislation tries to remedy this. First, however, I want to talk about the government content, because your government exam is Monday, and so I wanted that to be up front, and then to talk a little bit about the economics, sort of the more advanced economics that we kind of added onto this course, are talking about adverse selection and market failures that are prevalent in health insurance markets, and then to the more familiar economics in a moment. And so Obamacare prohibited insurance companies from price discriminating or denying people coverage because they had pre-existing conditions, and that was a very popular provision in the Affordable Care Act, and is a very popular provision in the Affordable Care Act today. The individual mandate, which tries to encourage people, or as more critics would characterize it, mandate people to purchase health insurance, is a important component of the law, which fines people that don't purchase health insurance. And then subsidies, we have discussed this at length in microeconomics. But let's get into the governmental content. And the first thing I wanted to talk about, we read that article about the Supreme Court case, NFIB versus Sebelius, which happened in 2012. And we saw how there was a lot of interesting constitutional questions that were presented before the court and that the court answered. And there was a lot of tension generated by this law, to say the least. And the first real, core things that was striking was Obamacare's attempt to, in the eyes of critics, coerce states to expand their Medicaid programs. So health insurance or health care, or Medicaid, is an interesting program because the states and the federal government, it's kind of like a concurrent program. The states and the federal government actually both fund these programs. And so the way that Obamacare tried to get states to expand their Medicaid programs, which is usually health insurance provided by the government to the poor, is that they said that if those states refused to expand their Medicaid programs, that they would withhold funding from that state's Medicaid programs writ large. So it was sort of like an all or nothing, like you either expand your Medicaid programs or we're not going to give you any funding at all. And so the Supreme Court said that this violated this core principle of federalism, and they actually struck that part of the law down, right? And just, me talking about the Supreme Court, right, talking about the Supreme Court's, reviewing this law is another piece of government content, obviously. Now, the part of the law that the Supreme Court did not strike down, which in a 5-4 decision, was the individual mandate. And the reason why the individual mandate was controversial was it was politically controversial because it was seen by perhaps some critics that claimed to be proponents of individual liberty as an infringement upon their individual liberty, as mandating people to purchase health insurance. It was also seen as perhaps by some legal scholars, conservative legal scholars, as not within the realm of authority of the federal government. And the Obama administration actually cited a clause in Article 1 of the Constitution called the Commerce Clause, which has been kind of one of the signature tools the federal government has used to acquire more and more power over time and to claim more authority. The Commerce Clause says that, or it's one of the enumerated powers, it says that Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce or business. And so the Obama administration was arguing that this gives Congress the authority to regulate health insurance markets. Now, the Supreme Court actually didn't buy this argument, but instead they said, in the majority opinion, they said, actually, the individual mandate is not a mandate. It's more like a tax because no one is actually compelled to purchase health insurance. They are instead taxed if they don't purchase health insurance. And that's well within Congress's power to tax. Remember the power of the purse. It's one of those 4 clauses that Congress can raise taxes. And so therefore the law is constitutional. So the Supreme Court essentially, in some critics' views, there was a lot of unhappy people on all sides of the aisle with this decision. Right? Conservatives were unhappy with the upholding of the individual mandate under the taxing power of Congress. Liberals might be upset about the court prohibiting the federal government from conditioning Medicaid funds to force those states to expand their Medicaid programs. And we can imagine that both sides angry with the decision might use the term judicial activism, a term that is used to kind of decry and criticize justices that people feel are legislating from the bench, meaning rewriting the laws instead of interpreting the laws and playing sort of like an umpire role. But who knows? There's also probably liberals that are happy that the court upheld the individual mandate, so on and so forth. And conservatives that may have been happy about the court sort of denying the federal government the ability to condition Medicaid funding on a expansion of Medicaid. But first, I wanted to also now talk about the advanced second, I want to talk about the advanced economics. So that's the government content out of the way. It's a very important federalism decision. Very important federalism decision. Look up the definition of federalism, my friends. And then another component of this law, what I also want to talk about is these 2 components and of the Affordable Care Act. The ban on insurance price discrimination, which is a very sort of popular component of Obamacare, and the individual mandate. And it's very hard to sort of sever these 2 ideas. And it gets into a little bit more advanced economics, but I think it's helpful for exercising your microeconomics brains and thinking about this. So I asked you to think about what this ban on insurance price discrimination would do to the price of health insurance without the individual mandate. And I said, a lot of you pointed out that more unhealthy people that were previously lacked health insurance would now acquire health insurance, and they would go rush to acquire it. And the ratio of unhealthy people to healthy people would increase. But if the ratio of unhealthy people, which are costly to insure, increases, or unhealthy people to healthy people increases, then we should expect the price of health insurance to increase. And if the price of health insurance increases, there's going to be more healthy people that were willing to purchase health insurance before that are no longer willing to purchase health insurance. They're going to go take a risk and they're going to exit the health insurance market. But if more unhealthy people exit the health insurance market and then the ratio of unhealthy people to healthy people increases further, the price is going to go up. And then this is going to be a kind of cyclical sort of process until the health insurance market collapses in upon itself. Right, so the individual mandate is a core component of Obamacare. This was designed in part by Jonathan Gruber, an economist at MIT, because it tries to address and stop this from taking place. So this is called a healthcare death spiral. And the way that it does this is it sort of finds people that refuse to purchase health insurance, and the subsidies themselves might encourage people to purchase health insurance too that are healthy. And the idea is to get the ratio, or to send more healthy people to purchase health insurance, so that way this death spiral does not take place. Pretty interesting, right? And so we got into sort of like the politics behind this, right? Where people might have liked this component of the law, but wanted this component of the law rescinded. But the economics behind this is you really need the individual mandate for this ban on price discrimination to sort of, work, right? Because otherwise, you should expect health insurance markets to completely collapse. So interesting. Now let's just transition to the costs in healthcare. And so we can use the monopoly model because we know that the the health industry provides all sorts of goods and resources. First, before we get into the monopoly model, a lot of you were able to recognize that in the health industry, there are all sorts of goods and resources that we can characterize as price inelastic demand, or demand curves characterized by as price inelastic. And as we can see here in this monopoly model, this is kind of a different point. But in this monopoly model, we within the health industry, I don't want to go into length about the consolidation of hospitals, which I think also tells the story about why health care is so healthcare costs are just so ridiculous in the United States. But the monopoly model itself can help us think about, we can insert any good or service related to healthcare, sort of graphically, the markup that you can charge in imperfectly competitive output markets. Right? Remember, the monopoly is an extreme, but it can teach us about the range of possibility that exists between these extremes. And the more consolidation that exists in the market, meaning the smaller the number of players or producers of goods and services in the market, the more you behave like a monopolist. And so here we can see, the marginal cost curve, the marginal revenue curve, profit maximizing rule, the intersection of these two curves go up to the demand curve across. That's the price that the monopolist is able to charge. We can see a price greater than the cost. We can see consumer surplus and producer surpluses in blue, but we also get a lot of deadweight loss. So producer surplus seems to be quite large, consumer surplus quite small. We get a lot of deadweight loss. We can also see Q star is the output that the monopolist produces, but QPC is the output a perfectly competitive market would produce, which is greater than the output the monopolist produces, and PPC is the price that perfectly competitive markets would use, which is smaller than the price that the monopolist charges. Pretty interesting, right? Now, this is assuming the monopolist can only charge one price. And we said that there are roles to be played, that if the government intervenes in a market, characterized by market failure, meaning a situation where leaving the market alone doesn't maximize social surplus, then we can actually install a price ceiling, and consumer and producer surplus can be quite, or we can actually fix the market failure. And if we install this price ceiling, very intentionally, perhaps at the price, or definitely at the price where the perfectly competitive market would produce, we can expand output and lower the price. And so we can see consumer surplus gains at producer surplus. Pretty cool, right? I also invited you to think about, we talked a lot about pharmaceutical and life-saving drug prices and how the government grants monopolies to producers of life-saving drugs. And we talked about why, and we said it was sort of like an incentive to encourage them to produce life-saving drugs, more life-saving drugs. And so in a weird way, the government sort of generates a market failure because they're trying to fix another market failure, which is called an externality, which we can see here. So an externality is a situation where the cost or benefit of your action is not fully internalized. And in this case, this is a positive production externality for research and development of life-saving drugs. And what this shows graphically is that firms have a view that the private marginal cost curve associated with producing life-saving drugs is higher than the social marginal cost curve, because once you produce life-saving drugs, or once you engage in research and development for the production of life-saving drugs, then other people can steal your ideas and sort of generate the same product, assuming that we don't have a patent system. And so you're not going to get to internalize all the benefits, so the costs associated with research and development of life-saving drugs is higher than the social marginal cost, meaning we get underproduction because we're producing at Q1, but society would prefer us to produce at Q2. too. So the way that you can rectify this externality is to provide subsidies. The way that the government does this in the case of the pharmaceutical industry is to just grant pharmaceutical companies monopolies. Now, obviously, this leads to a trade-off, and we can talk more about that in class. All right, that's it for today's video.